Hey everyone, today I'm super excited to bring you a brand new lecture on Better-Auth. So Better-Auth is quickly becoming one of the most popular authentication solutions for Node.js, as well as many other client-side frameworks, and it's for good reason. It essentially abstracts away the concept of authentication and authorization into a really lightweight and easy to use framework. And in this lecture, we're going to see how we can integrate it into a NestJS backend with a Next.js UI. So as always, I'll leave a link below to the docs here if you want to first take a look at what Better-Auth is and dive a bit deeper. So let's go ahead and jump right into the lecture and start integrating Better-Auth and see how we can utilize it inside a NestJS backend and a Next.js UI to add authentication to our application very easily with very little work. Now, before we jump in case you haven't already signed up for my membership website, you definitely should check it out because it contains hundreds of hours of exclusive developer content, including advanced topics in Nest.js and full stack development. Additionally, you get access to all of my available best-selling Udemy courses. And finally, you're going to get access to the brand new course that I'm going to be developing over the next couple of months, which is not going to be available on Udemy until much later on. So make sure you check out my developer membership site. I'll leave a link below. Thank you so much for supporting my work. And let's go ahead and jump right into the lecture. So we're going to go ahead and get started by setting up our project. In this case, I'm going to utilize a turbo repo monorepo so that we can quickly and easily set up our applications inside of a single repository and share code as needed. So let's go ahead and initialize a new turbo repo using pnpm. To do this, I'm going to use the pnpm command dlx create turbo at latest. Now feel free to use whichever package manager you prefer. In my case, I like pnpm thanks to its fast dependency cache. So I'll go ahead and install it into a new directory that I'll just call Better-Auth, and we'll use pnpm package manager. So we'll go ahead and wait until it initializes the project here and installs our dependencies. So now that our project has finished setting up, we'll go ahead and cd into the project directory, and I'll open it up inside of VS Code. So here we can see the default starting project for a new turbo repo. Now I'm not going to dive deep into turbo repo architecture in this lecture. Of course, I have separate videos on turbo repo that I can link below if you're interested in checking it out. But essentially we have generated here separate applications. So these are some dummy Next.js applications that turbo repo comes with out of the box, as well as some shared code inside of the packages folder. So let's go ahead and clean this up and get it ready for our project. So we can go ahead and start by removing the shared UI library since we're not going to use it in our project. And then I'll remove the docs application since we only need a single Next.js app. So we'll keep the web directory. Let's next go into the package.json. And in here you can see it's referencing that UI library here as a workspace dependency. So I'll go ahead and remove this since it's no longer being used. And now we can go ahead and update our Next.js UI here to strip out some of the starting bits. So we'll go ahead and start off by removing the page module CSS, which we won't need. In the root page component, I'll go ahead and simply remove everything. And instead, let's just re-export a default home page. That's simply going to go ahead and return an empty JSX expression for now. So now we should have this empty home page. We have the default root layout.tsx, which is rendering our root HTML and body, as well as all of the children. So this is fine to leave as is. I'll also go ahead and reset our global CSS file. Later on, we're going to add some basic styling with Tailwind, so we'll set that up in a bit. For now, let's just get everything at a clean slate. And at this point, we should have the Next.js UI all set up and emptied out to start building our project. We can go ahead and test it out by heading back in the terminal, and we can use the turbo repo CLI to actually execute our dev server. So this will execute the dev command here we have in our package.json for the next application. We're just going to run next dev and start up the development server. So we'll go ahead and run turbo dev to start up the dev command inside of each of our apps, in this case the Next.js UI, and that'll start up the Next.js application here on localhost 3000. So go ahead and open this up in your browser. And you should see here just an empty blank page, which is exactly what we want. It means our next app is up and running and we have an empty blank slate. So that's great. So now that we have the UI ready to go, let's go ahead and add our NestJS Backend, which the Next.js UI will be talking to for its authentication. So setting up the Nest Backend is going to be quite simple. Let's go ahead and at the root of our project, we'll cd back into apps now. And we can use the Nest CLI to generate a new Nest application by using nest new, and I'll call this backend. So I'll use npm package manager, and that will simply create this new backend directory with a starting Nest app inside of our mono repo here. So now that we have the Nest app created, make sure we cd directly into backend and recursively remove a couple of directories. So go ahead and remove .git and the node modules folder. Because both of these directories are handled by turbo repo in our root, we don't want Nest handling this inside the subdirectory. So with these two deleted, we can rerun npm install from the root, and now we should be ready to actually run the NestJS backend. We just have to make a few tweaks to it. So the only thing we need to do to our Nest backend, which we can see has been generated here in the backend directory, well, by default, if we open up our main TS for our Nest backend, we know in the bootstrap function here, we are setting up our HTTP server and listening on this default port of 3000. However, this port is already taken by our Next.js UI. So what I want to do is go into the web package.json and simply update the dev script here for Next.js to point to 3001 so that we don't conflict our ports. And then finally, we need to open up our package.json for the NestJS backend. And our start dev command here is how we start up our dev server. However, we want this to be in line with the turbo dev command that we run, which will start up both of our applications. So we'll simply rename it to dev so that we start up the NestJS development server here and recompile with any changes. So with these simple changes in place, we should be able to rerun turbo dev from the root, which will execute the dev command in both applications. In this case, start up our NestJS backend here and the Next.js UI. And so if we go back to our browser, we should be able to navigate to 3001. And at 3001, we can see we have our default Next.js UI again, just as we had before. And at 3000, we have the NestJS backend default app controller route here responding with hello world. So this is great. It means both of our applications are up and running here and responding to traffic. And we check the Nest backend, we see that the single route we have set up here at the root with the app controller is simply returning that hello world stub string, and that's why we see it here at localhost 3000. So with this in place, we now have both of our applications sitting inside of the turbo repo. We're ready to set up Better-Auth inside of both of these applications and see how easy it is to get up and running with Better-Auth and adding end-to-end authentication to our apps. Let's go ahead and get started doing this next. All right, so to start off, let's go ahead and install the dependencies we're going to need for our NestJS backend. So I'll cd into apps backend. And now let's go ahead and install the dependencies. So we'll npm install. So in Better-Auth, we actually leverage a persistence layer to actually store our authentication information. So for example, we're actually going to be storing our underlying users and sessions inside of a database. So in this project, we're going to use Postgres as our database, and I'll use Drizzle ORM to actually establish the connection inside of our Nest backend. So in order to facilitate this, let's go ahead and make sure that we install Drizzle ORM, Postgres as well. Next up, we're going to go ahead and install at nestjs/config to read in environment variables. And we're going to install Better-Auth itself. Last but not least, there's a package that actually integrates Better-Auth directly into NestJS backends. Now, at the time of this recording, there's actually a missing key feature inside of this NestJS Better-Auth library that allows us to use dynamic NestJS module configuration. So to get around this, I've actually forked the repository and created my own version of the package that I'm going to use in this lecture. I have an open pull request in the original repository that's pending approval. So once that's merged, you'll be able to use the original NestJS Better-Auth package. And I'll leave a link below in the comments when this is ready to use. However, before this is merged, we'll go ahead and use the updated version. And we'll see why this is important later on when we set it up. So in this case, that's going to be at mgui/nestjs-better-auth. And just to point this out, this is the original repository here for NestJS Better-Auth that I'll leave a link to below. You can see in pull requests, I've actually opened up this PR here to support dynamic module configuration in NestJS, and this should be merged in any day now. So like I said, I'll leave a comment below once this is available to use, and then you can install it using this command here. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and use the forked version that I've introduced and add all of these dependencies. So now we have the dependencies. We'll also go ahead and npm add -d to add development dependencies. We're going to go ahead and add @types/pg for Postgres, and we'll get drizzle kit here so that we can actually run migrations against our Postgres database. So now we should have all the dependencies we need for our NestJS backend to integrate with Better-Auth. Let's go ahead and start setting it up. First thing we'll go ahead and do is set up our database connection using drizzle ORM. So in our backend directory, I'll create a new folder inside of source, and we'll call this database. And while we're at it, I'll just go ahead and remove the default app files here since we'll not actually use them in our project. So let's go ahead and remove the starting app files and also remove them from the app module. So now in the database directory, I'll create my database.module, and in here we'll go ahead and add a new @module decorator and export class database module. So let's go ahead and make sure we import this correctly from NestJS Common. And we'll go ahead and set up our module here. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we have the config module available inside of our application. So to read in environment variables so that we can find the URL to the database. So in the app module, I'll add our imports to the config module for root. And the config module is going to be imported from @nestjs/config. And so this is going to use the .env library to read in environment variables from a .env file, and that's where we're going to keep our connection to our database. So in the backend directory, we can create a .env, and we'll add our URL to the database. Now you need to make sure you have a Postgres database running on your machine. In my case, on Mac, I'm running PostgreSQL Mac client here. So you can set up PostgreSQL on your machine, and I'll leave a link below where you can get Postgres depending on your operating system. So make sure you have it up and running. And then additionally, I'm using pgadmin to actually interact with the database as a GUI tool. So I recommend pgadmin as an easy tool to interact with your Postgres database. So I'll go ahead and open this up because we need to make sure we have a database created beforehand that our application can connect to. So with pgadmin open, I'm going to go ahead and connect to my local Postgres server. Now I already have one set up here, so I'll go ahead and remove it so that I can show you how I add a new one. So I'll quickly right click on it and then click register server, and I'll add the local server. In my case, I'll simply call it local and go to connection tab. So in my case, my local address is going to be my loopback address here at localhost, so 127.0.0.1, a port of 5432, which is the default Postgres port. And then the username and password by default is simply Postgres, and password is Postgres. So go ahead and enter these credentials in. You should be able to save, and then connect to the local database. You can see all of my databases here. To create a new one, I'll simply right click on it and create a new database. For this lecture, I'll call this Better-Auth and save it. So now we have the Better-Auth database available and ready to connect to. Let's head back to our .env, where we'll go ahead and provide a database URL to connect to. And I'll go ahead and set this equal to the Postgres connection string. So that'll be Postgres : / and then the username and password. So that's again Postgres : Postgres, and the address now. So in our case, I can just use localhost : 5432 / database name, which is Better-Auth, the name we just created. So now we have the connection string to the database. Let's head back to our app module. Well, we're reading in this .env thanks to this config module import. And finally, back in the database module, we can now use it to set up our database connection. So in the imports array, make sure we import the config module so it's available in this database module. And we're going to set up a new providers array and provide the database connection as a NestJS provider so that we can inject it later on where we need to, in this case, actually provide it to our Better-Auth instance. So in here, we'll now provide a new object and we'll give this a provider token, which is how we identify this provider here and later on. So I'll create a dedicated constant for this in database directory called database connection.ts, and we can go ahead and then export const database connection, which will be a simple string. So this is again how we identify this provider later on when we need to access it and inject it. So now we have the injection token. We can use it here as the provider. And now for the underlying value for this provider, we're going to use useFactory from NestJS that allows us to inject dependencies directly here when we're setting up the provider. And that's because, well, we need to get access to a config service, which allows us to read environment variables in the NestJS recommended way. So we'll reference the config service of type config service from NestJS config and open up a function here where the first thing we need to do is create our Postgres connection pool, which is actually establishing the connection to the underlying database. So I'll define a new const pool and set it equal to new pool from PG. Now in Postgres, a connection pool represents a group of connections to the database, and this helps us to improve throughput because our application won't be stuck behind waiting a single connection. Instead, we can have multiple connections that allow for concurrency in our application if we have multiple requests needing a connection to the database. So inside of pool, we simply provide a config object where now we provide the connection string, which is where we actually connect to the database. Well, since we just set this up through an environment variable, we can now use the config service .getterThrow to read the database URL environment variable that we just set up. So now that we have the pool object, we're ready to return the drizzle function. So go ahead and explicitly import drizzle from at drizzle orm / node Postgres. So this drizzle constructor function will take in the pool object we just created, and then it's going to take in the schema, which represents the actual shape of the database that we have. And this is important because drizzle orm is a type-safe ORM that actually generates types for us based off of our database schema. And so to do this, we provide a second object where we set the schema equal to the actual database schema. Now, we're going to fill this in later with the actual types from Better-Auth. For now, we can set it equal to an empty object. So now we have the drizzle database connection, which allows us to actually interact with our database inside of our application. The last step is to make sure we have an inject array where we add the config service so that it's available here inside of our useFactory. Finally, make sure we also add an exports array to this module where we explicitly now export the database connection so it can be used elsewhere inside of our app. So with the database modules set up, we actually have everything we need to now set up our Better-Auth integration. So let's head back to the root app module, where the first thing I'll do is make sure we import the database module so that it's available in our application. And now we're going to go ahead and use the auth module from the NestJS Better-Auth package that we're using. And now we can see we have the for-root async function available. Now previously, as I mentioned, in the original library, before this PR goes in, for-root async was not actually available, so we couldn't actually inject dependencies, in this case our database connection, when actually instantiating the Better-Auth instance. But now in this new PR I've introduced, we have for-root async available. And so now let's use it to actually set up our Better-Auth instance. So this auth module is going to integrate Better-Auth into the Nest app. However, it needs the actual Better-Auth instance instantiated, and that's what we're going to do inside of here using useFactory. So as we saw before, useFactory allows us to inject dependencies inside of this function. So we're going to inject now our database connection that we just created. And so this database connection is of type node PG database from Drizzle ORM node Postgres. And then we can return an object here, which is going to have a single property of type auth, which is going to be the Better-Auth instance. So to create the instance, all we have to do is call this Better-Auth function. And so we import Better-Auth from Better-Auth. And so now we can call this function and pass it in a configuration object where we have a number of options that we can configure on Better-Auth, including the actual underlying database we use to persist our authentication information. We can add social providers like Google, GitHub, and more, and specify generic authentication options like the secret or the session configuration, like how long a session is valid for. Now again, there's a number of options we can configure, and I'll leave a link below to the docs where you can learn more about configuring this Better-Auth instance. Let's go ahead and configure the basic setup we need to add authentication to our app, which in our case is going to be simply the database property. And Better-Auth already provides adapters that work with several ORMs. So in our case, we're going to use the Drizzle adapter to connect our Drizzle ORM to Better-Auth. So we have to go ahead and then import Drizzle adapter from Better-Auth /adapters/Drizzle. So now we have Drizzle adapter available. In this adapter, we then call it as a function and provide it the underlying database connection object, which we now have available thanks to our dependency injection here. So we provide the database and then a config object where we set the provider to whatever database we're using. So in our case, that's going to be Postgres, so we just set it to PG. And lastly, we'll update our inject array here to make sure that we are actually injecting the database connection provider that we set up before in our database module. And so now with this in place, we've actually set up our Better-Auth integration inside of this NestJS backend. So finally, make sure we add an imports array to this auth module and make sure we explicitly import database module here instead of the root app module so that it's available inside of the useFactory. And so now with this in place, if we rerun turbo dev, we can see that our Nest application has been correctly configured, and we can see that the auth module has initialized Better-Auth here on /API/auth. And this is really amazing because, well, by default, NestJS Better-Auth actually sets up all of the auth API endpoints we need to support authentication. So it's automatically going to create the login and sign up endpoints that our Next.js UI is going to use later on and implement all the functionality without us having to do anything. So we'll have the ability to create new users, log in with that user, and establish a session, which we'll see later on what actually it does to the database by creating a new session in the database and actually setting a secure JWT cookie on our login request, without us having to implement any functionality. And this is really what makes Better-Auth so great, is that it's going to do all of this for us without us having to do anything. Now, there's one final thing we need to do before moving on, and that's actually make sure that we generate our database schema that Better-Auth requires to actually persist the user and session information to our database and apply those migrations using Drizzle. Now, Better-Auth actually offers a CLI to automatically generate the schema that Drizzle ORM needs to apply our migrations. However, at the time of this recording, there's no way for NestJS Better-Auth to do this inside of this app module. Instead, we actually have to create a dummy auth client that the Better-Auth CLI can actually read to automatically generate our schema. So in order to support this, we'll create a new auth folder inside of source, and we'll create a new auth.ts file. And so in here, we're going to go ahead and simply copy our existing Better-Auth instance from app module, and let's paste it here. And so let's go ahead and export const auth, set it equal to Better-Auth, and make sure we go ahead and add the imports we need. So we'll import Better-Auth as well as the Drizzle adapter here. And finally, we're going to actually set the database here to an empty object because, like I said, this is just a dummy instance that we're not going to use in the app, but instead is going to be used by the Better-Auth CLI to generate our migrations. And that's because Better-Auth CLI currently expects the auth instance to be exported like this format. However, in our case, we know in Nest.js, it's not great to create instances like this outside of the injection context. Instead, we want to be doing it here in a use factory where we can follow Nest.js best practices and declare it as a provider with our database instance. So this dummy instance here really solely is just for the CLI to actually generate our migrations, and we'll see this in a second. Now, we'll also need to make another change to our TS config to avoid these type errors here. So go back to our TS config, and I'll simply set declaration to false, and that should resolve this auth error that we were getting. And so now at this point, we're ready to use the Better-Auth CLI to generate our migrations. So let's head back to our terminal, and I'll cd into apps backend. And so now in this directory, we're going to go ahead and use the Better-Auth CLI here using npx and use the generate command. And so this is going to go ahead and firstly install Better-Auth CLI, and it's going to go ahead and use our auth.ts instance to actually read in the current adapter and database provider that we're using. In this case, we're using Drizzle adapter with Postgres. It's going to generate the corresponding schema for us. In this case, make sure we also pass the config flag and explicitly point this to /source auth/auth.ts so that it actually finds our dummy auth instance. And you can see here it's going to ask if it wants to generate the schema. We'll go ahead and say yes. And so now it's generated the schema for us. And so let's go ahead and take a look at what this is. So this will create the auth schema at the root of our project. So in this case, you can see it's actually generated the underlying Drizzle ORM schema that our application needs to provide to our Drizzle ORM instance, which we know is used to actually provide type information to our application and ultimately generate migration scripts to create the schema inside of our Postgres database. And we can actually see the shape of the Better-Auth database schema here that is used. So we have a Postgres table here for the underlying user with certain properties like the name and email. We also have a table for the underlying session where we store the token, expiration date, some additional information as well. And finally, an account and verification table. Now again, there are dedicated docs to going over the Better-Auth database schema and what each of these properties actually does. I'm not going to go over here, but I'll leave a link below. But now that we actually have this schema, I'll go ahead and move it into the auth directory, and I'll rename it to simply be schema. And so now that we have this, we can now use Drizzle Kit to generate the underlying raw Postgres migration scripts that we can actually apply against our database and get the database in line with this schema here. So in order to do this, Well, we'll go ahead and in our backend folder, we'll create a drizzle.config.ts file. And this is the file that DrizzleKit reads in to actually understand how and where to execute migrations against. So we'll go ahead and export default define config. And so this will be imported define config from DrizzleKit. So now we have define config. We provide this in options object. So the first thing is to define the schema files that we're actually going to read in and create migration scripts for. In our case, that'll be inside of source. And I like to create a wildcard here and look for any file that has schema.ts name, just like the schema.ts for auth we just renamed. So that'll ensure we're reading in the auth schema. Then we'll provide the out directory. So where do we want to generate the migration scripts to? I'll just use drizzle folder. Finally, we have dialect here that we need to set to PostgreSQL and the database credentials themselves. So here we can set the URL equal to process.env database URL, which is equal to the value we set here inside of our .env to connect to the database. So now that we have the config option set up, one more thing I want to do is make sure we don't forget to go back to the database module. And remember, we set the schema object here to an empty object. Now we want to actually add our auth schema. And so this is to ensure that our code actually has type information around the Better-Auth schema so that when we interact potentially with the Better-Auth tables using Drizzle ORM, we'll have that type safety and our code will know about the actual schema. To do this, we have to provide the schema here. And I'll just simply spread auth schema and explicitly import now star as auth schema from, and make sure we import this from our auth folder /schema. And so now we're providing the schema to our Drizzle ORM. That'll make sure our code is aware of it. And we have our Drizzle config set up to read in the schema and generate migration scripts. So let's go ahead and finally generate those using DrizzleKit. To do this, we'll run pnpm DrizzleKit generate to read in that auth schema. And you can see here it's actually detected the 4 Better-Auth tables as well as some foreign keys. And it's created a raw SQL migration file in that Drizzle out folder. So we can see this now inside of the Drizzle directory it's created. We have the raw SQL script that we can now run against our database to actually get the schema in line with our code. So let's go ahead and finally do this using DrizzleKit again. Instead of generate, we'll simply run migrate, which will run that script against our database. And now you can see that it was supplied successfully. We should now be able to go back into pgadmin. And if I open up the Better-Auth database, schema public, and open up tables, we can now see the 4 Better-Auth tables that were actually created. So if I open up one of these, for example, the users table, we can now see all of the columns on the user that we'd expect. And this is great. We can see that we have Better-Auth integrated to our database using Drizzle ORM and our NestJS Backend. And so now we can actually persist our authentication information to the database, and Better-Auth will automatically read from it based off of this schema all automatically. I'll create a new controller inside of our backend. So this will be a users directory, and we'll create a users module to start. So we'll decorate this module here and export it as users module. And I want to set up a users controller to add a dummy endpoint to simply get our session. So we'll create the users controller and decorate it with @controller and prefix it with users. And we'll export class users controller, and I'll add a single get route here and call it session. And we'll have get session. So later on, we'll actually return the underlying session using Better-Auth, but for now, I'll just return an empty object. And make sure in the app module, we import the users module here so that our application brings it in. and we register this new controller. And in the users module, we'll have to add the controllers array and add that new users controller that we just created. And so now, in order to apply authentication to our application globally, we can make use of the default auth guard that NestJS Better-Auth comes with. Now, in order to apply this to all routes in our application, we can do this through a global guard inside of our app module. So we can provide a new provider here, and we simply set the provider here to app guard. We'll set the use class to auth guard now from our NestJS Better-Auth package here. And so now what this does is it automatically applies the auth guard, which will use Better-Auth to authenticate us and see if we have a JWT cookie on the incoming request, which is what Better-Auth sets when we log the user in. So now if I open up my Postman here and I send a request to localhost 3000/user/session and try to send a request, you can see I'm getting 401 unauthorized, and this is because we don't actually have a JWT cookie set on the request, meaning we're not authorized, and Better-Auth is protecting our application globally, and this is excellent. So now we have end-to-end authentication in our app with just a very few lines of code. So now we have Better-Auth set up inside of our NestJS backend. We're ready to actually use the Better-Auth client library that it offers for Next.js to easily set up a login and sign up component, as well as some session hooks in React to display our signed in user information and utilize this Better-Auth NestJS backend. Let's go ahead and get started setting this up next. Additionally, we can make sure that our Better-Auth endpoints that our auth module has initialized here are up and available by actually hitting a health check endpoint that Better-Auth offers. So we can hit our API/API/auth, and there's a /OK endpoint here. So if we send that API auth OK at localhost 3000, we can see we get OK true returned back. And this is showing us that the default Better-Auth endpoints are available and serving traffic, which means we are ready to use Better-Auth from our backend in our Next.js UI. Alright, so now we're ready to start integrating our authentication into our Next.js app. So let's go ahead and get started by adding the dependencies that we'll need. So I'll cd into apps web folder, and we'll go ahead and npm install Better-Auth. So Better-Auth also offers a client-side implementation to easily offer React hooks and API calls that will automatically connect to the Better-Auth implementation on our backend. So this is the only dependency we'll need. We'll go ahead and install this. We're also going to go ahead and install Tailwind to be able to apply some basic styling to our application. So we'll go ahead and npm install development Tailwind CSS at Tailwind CSS/post CSS and post CSS. Alright, so now we have the dependencies we need. Let's go ahead and get started by firstly setting up Tailwind so that we can style our app and make it look nice. So inside of our web directory, just make sure we create a postcss.config.mjs at the root of web. And we simply need to create a config object in here. So we'll create const config, and in here we have a plugins object where we set at Tailwind CSS/post CSS, and we can set this to an empty object, and then make sure we export default config. And then finally, we need to go into our app global.css and make sure we import Tailwind CSS. And so now we have everything we need to use Tailwind inside of our application and have some nice styling. So let's go ahead and now set up our auth client. So inside of our web directory, I'll create a new lib folder. And in here, I'll create a new auth client.ts file. And now we're going to go ahead and export this const auth client and set it equal to create auth client from Better-Auth. And you can see all of the client-side implementations that it offers here. So we have basic JavaScript client, or we have one for React itself, and that's what we're going to use. And that's because it'll offer us pre-built hooks we can use to get information around authentication, like the current session, user, and more. And so now inside of the create auth client, all we have to do is specify where our backend auth server is actually listening so that the Better-Auth client will send requests to it based off of this address. And so in our case, well, our backend is listening on a different URL. And in order to avoid CORS error, we're going to set up a proxy in our next config to proxy requests at /API to our backend. So for now, let's set the base path option, and that'll make sure requests go to the current URL at the path we specify. So I want that to be /API/auth. And so this will ensure that we actually send requests as expected. Now, in order to get rid of this type error, I'm going to do the same thing we did earlier by going to our TS config for the Next.js app and set the declaration to false as well. And so now we have the working auth client available. Let's head to the next config and make sure we set up that proxy. And so in here, we want to define a rewrites function that will go ahead and return an array of rewrites. So in this case, we'll have a single rewrite where we'll set the source, which is where the URL request originates from that we want to rewrite. In our case, we know that's going to be at /API, what we just indicated our auth client would send requests to. And then we can use :path to extract anything after that to proxy it on to our backend. So now we can go ahead and set the destination as well. And so here we can actually read environment variables to get our backend server address. So in Next.js, we read environment variables by default. We just have to create a .m file here, and I'll set the API URL address environment variable equal to our backend server, in this case simply at localhost 3000. So now we can read this in the next config to set the destination equal to, well, we'll pull off the process.env.api URL that we just created. And then we're going to send this to our backend at the same /API and pass on anything afterwards using that path. So we have one small typo here. Make sure we include a star at the end of our path in both cases here so that we actually capture the regex after API properly. So now that we actually have our auth client available, let's go ahead and make use of it by actually getting our session information and rendering it on our home page. So I'll go back into our root page.tsx, our home page, and now we can actually use the auth client to get the session hook. So what we'll go ahead and do is create a new const here where we destructure data of type session. I'll rename it to session. And then we also get an isPending property that I'll call isLoading. And so we can pull this off directly off of the auth client that we just created. And we can see here the auth client provides us with all of these useful client-side functions around authentication. So we can use it to call sign in, sign out, sign up, update the user, verify email, reset password. And so all of these client-side authentication methods that we have access to will actually call the backend Better-Auth instance that we set up. And it's doing this because we provided it the endpoint to our backend. And so we get access to all this functionality on the client side without us having to write any code, which is awesome. And so we want to pull off use session here, which actually will return us the current logged in users session and get access to the user if they're logged in. So now we have access to the underlying session. Let's use this to render some JSX. So first we can check to see if we're currently loading. Then we'll go ahead and return a loading div here that just says loading, and I'll set some Tailwind styles here. So flex, justify center, item center, and min height screen. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like if I just invert the Boolean here. And now, of course, if we try to look at the component here, we get an error complaining that we can't access client state because we're by default in a server-side component at the moment. So let's convert this to a use client component to make sure that we're rendering this on the client side. And so now we can see we have the loading indicator here while the user's information is being fetched. So we can go ahead and reset this. Now we get the blank empty page again. And so now let's go ahead and render some JSX. If we do have an underlying session, meaning the user's logged in, then we want to return a div here with class name of container, mx auto, padding 4, padding y8, And inside of here, I'll give another div and apply max width medium, MX auto, text center. And now in this div, I want to actually output an H1 message that welcomes the user. So we'll just say welcome. And we can add some styling here and say text 3XL, font bold, and margin bottom 4. And then we can then use the user's session information. So in this paragraph tag, I'll have class name of margin bottom 4, and we can actually pull off the user session information. So we can say you are signed in as, and we can destructure here the session that we have access to. And you can see underneath the session, we actually have the .user property, and we have all of the properties for the current signed in user. So we can output their name here to welcome them to our app. Additionally, I want to provide a simple button that they can click to log out of their current session. So let's create a new button component here. And I'll have some sign out text. And we can give it some basic styling. So background red 600. Make the text white. Give it some padding. And some rounded styles, as well as some basic hover styles here. So we'll add the ability to let the user sign out, and then when the user actually clicks on this button now, we'll add an on-click listener, and all we have to do is create a callback function, and then on the auth client, we actually have the sign out function that we can call. And what this is going to do is, well, when we sign in to the user, well, when we actually sign in and call our Better-Auth implementation on the back end, as we'll see later on, we're actually creating a secure JWT cookie. And so signing out here will actually remove that cookie and make sure we're no longer authenticated. It will also call the backend to remove the session from the database. Now let's go ahead and finally render our default JSX. If the user doesn't have a session yet, well, they need a way to sign in or sign up. So here we'll go ahead and return a new root div. And just like we did before, let's give this some container styling. So container MX auto, and give it some padding. So inside of here, we'll now make sure we align everything using flex, justify center, and margin bottom 8. So now inside of this div, I'll add another container div. And this is going to actually house our buttons to sign in or sign up. And so I'll make this a class name of background gray 100. Give it a little bit of padding and round it as well. And so now inside of this div, we actually want to go ahead and render our sign in and sign up buttons. Now we're going to render the sign up and sign up forms directly inside of the component here. So we want to maintain some state to determine if the sign up or sign in form is currently active. To do this, we'll simply add a new bit of state up here. So we'll add the active form and set active form. And this will simply use state from React. And by default, we'll have it as the login form. And so the state here can either be login or sign up as the state. So now what we can do is go back to our rounded button container, and let's add a new button here. This will be for the sign in and sign up. So we'll add an on-click listener here, and this will be for the sign in. So when the user clicks this, we'll set the active form now to be login. And I'll go ahead and also set some class styling here. So we'll have a dynamic class styling based on whether or not this button is currently active. So we'll add some default padding, rounded medium, and now we'll add an expression that checks to see if the active form is currently login. Then we want a different set of styles. So we'll make the background white, shadow small. Otherwise, we'll have the styling as text gray 600, hover text gray 800. And so this will give us a nice effect depending on whether or not this button is active. And we'll add the sign in text. And so now for the sign up button, it's going to be essentially the same exact setup here. So I'll copy this sign in button and paste it below and change it to sign up now. And now the only thing we need to change is set active form. So set active form should be sign up now. And the active form check should check to see if we're rendering sign up. And so now if we go back to our component, we can see we have this nice selector between sign in and sign up, which is great. And so now finally, we just need to render the actual forms below so the user can enter their credentials to create an account or sign in using our Better-Auth client. All right, so next up, let's go ahead and actually render these sign up and sign in forms. Let's go ahead and create a new components directory at the root here. And this is where we'll put these dedicated components. So I'll go ahead and create a new auth-forms.tsx. And so we'll go ahead and start with our login form. So we'll export function login form. And so we'll go ahead and firstly mark this as use client, since we're going to need client-side interactivity here to track our state and add click listeners. So let's add some state here. We need to get the user's email. So we'll capture this with email and set email. Set this equal to use state and an empty string. And so I'll go ahead and copy this again as for the password. So we'll collect the password, email, and we'll have one more for loading. So we'll set password and set password here. And we'll call this one is loading and set is loading. So during the loading state, we can render out something different. And so now let's go ahead and return the JSX for the form itself. So we'll go ahead and return a form here. And for the onSubmit function, we want to create a new dedicated handle submit function. So we'll set this equal to an async function that gets passed in the event of type react.form event here. And by default, we'll just call prevent default on the event so that we don't reload the page and we can handle the functionality ourselves. In this case, we're going to use the auth client to sign the user in. So now we can pass handle submit to the form itself. And now let's go ahead and render out the form inputs. So firstly, I'll add an h2, and this will have a class name. And I'll add some class styling here. So we'll call this text 2XL, font bold, and we'll call this sign in. And now inside of this form, I'll add another root div and provide firstly the label. So HTML4 will be for email, and class name will set to block, text small, and font medium. And so now inside the label, we'll provide the email label. So now we have the label provide the underlying input here, and we'll give it type email. ID will be email. The value will be the email state that we're tracking. And then we'll set required on it. And finally, the onChange listener. Well, here we're simply going to destructure that event and then call set email. And this will be equal to the event target.value, which will include the new email the user's inputting. And finally, we'll add some styling. So I'll give it some margin, block with full, some padding here as well, and a nice border just to make it look a bit nicer. So now we have the input here for the email. Let's go ahead and make sure that we're actually rendering this on our home page so we can see it as we start developing. So go back to the root page.tsx, the home page now, and we'll go ahead and make sure we actually render out the form underneath our root div here. So we'll check to see if the active form is equal to login. Then we'll render our login form component that we just created. Otherwise, well, we'll leave this empty until we have the sign up form ready. So now if we go back to the home page, we can see we have the sign in form here, which is great. Now let's also add some basic styling to our form tag to make sure that the form isn't so large on big screens. So we can give it some space here and then set the max width to medium and MX auto. And so that'll make sure our form here is not too large on larger screens. So that looks good. So now for the password, I'll just go ahead and copy this entire section here that we have and paste it. So now for password, I'll just go ahead and copy the entire div that we have here and paste it beneath. So we'll just swap out now. HTML4 will be password. Change the label now to be for password. And finally, the input itself, we can set this to type password. Change the ID as well. And of course, the value will be password. And change the change listener here to now be called set password instead. And so now we have the password itself here, which looks good. Finally, we need the actual button to submit the form. So for this, I'll just render out a new button component, and we'll give this some attributes. So this type will be of type submit to actually invoke the form handler, in our case, the handle submit function. And we can set the disabled prop equal to is loading. So if we're currently invoking our handle submit function, we don't want to allow for duplicate submissions. So then make sure we set is loading here to a Boolean value, which should be false by default, not a string. And so now for the text, we can use is loading, check to see if we're still loading. Then we'll render out signing in text, else it'll be called sign in. And so then we'll also apply some class to the submit button. So I'll go ahead and add some styling here, give it a background, and some additional styles just to make it look a bit nicer. Again, you can feel free to set whatever styles you'd like. This is just going to give us some basic styling to make it look pretty good. So now we have the nice looking sign in button here available. This is great. Let's go ahead and essentially duplicate the same logic we have now for the sign up form before we finish up by creating our handle submit function. So I'll go ahead and copy the login form and repaste it below as the sign up form now. So just go ahead and change the component name to sign up form instead. And now we'll have the set email, set password. I also want another field now to track the user's name. So we'll set this to name and set name. And the form itself is going to look very similar. We can maintain both of these fields we already have. However, now I want to copy one more and make sure we have the user's name. So we'll paste it above the email. Make sure we change the text to be sign up. Now we'll change this to be for name instead. And we'll change the input type here to simply be text, ID, name. Change the value out as well. And the listener should be set name instead of set email. Lastly, make sure we also go down and change the submit button. So if is loading, we should say signing up instead of signing in. So just change the text out here to sign up. And so now we have the sign up form complete. Let's go back to our page, DSX, the home page, and make sure we render, if the active form now is sign up, we can render the sign up form instead. And so now with this in place, we can go back to our app and click between the two forms and now render the sign up form here and the sign in. So now with this in place, we're ready to actually implement our form submit handlers to allow the user to be created and sign up. So let's go ahead and get started next. So for our form submission handlers, we're going to go ahead and start off with sign up. So the first thing we'll do is set is loading to true to make sure the user can't submit it twice. And then we'll open up a try catch block here to catch any errors that occur, because we are reaching out to our backend where our Better-Auth instance is set up. And now to actually submit the sign up, all we have to do is await a call to our auth client, and we can use the .sign up function that it offers us. And this is automatically going to call our backend API auth sign up endpoint that has been created thanks to the NestJS Better-Auth module. So here we can actually see the options we have to sign up for. In this case, we're going to use .email, and pass in the properties needed. So we'll pass in the email, password, in this case name of the user. And so now we should be able to sign the user up. If any errors occur, we can just simply log them out in the console. So we'll say sign up failed and log out the error. And we'll add a finally here to set is loading to false now. So now sign up should be working properly. Let's go ahead and copy this logic now back into our sign in form, handle submit function. The only thing we need to change now is the call here to .sign in instead, and remove the name. So now we're able to sign in and sign up. We're ready to actually test this functionality out. Let's head back to the component and open up our network tab so we can see the request being sent to the backend. So if I go to sign up and enter in some test credentials here and click sign up, we can see that our request is actually stuck pending. Now the reason we're seeing this is because we're actually missing a couple of configuration options for our Better-Auth instance on the backend. In order to do this, we need to make sure we head to our NestJS backend and update our .env. So Better-Auth actually requires a couple of environment variables out of the box to work properly that we're missing currently. So the first of these is going to be the Better-Auth URL, and this should be equal to the current URL of the server. So in this case, that's localhost 3000. And then we need the Better-Auth secret. So this is going to be the actual secret value that's used when we create JWT tokens and when we actually verify them. So in order to find a secure token, I like to use randomkeygen.com. You can simply just copy encryption key here, something that's a very strong random value. To make sure we correct this, this should be Better-Auth secret and Better-Auth URL. And there's a final change we need to make to our Nest server. In the main TS, we need to explicitly ensure that we're disabling body parser because Better-Auth does not work with it enabled. So we go ahead and set body parser to false here. And now we should be able to send requests to our backend successfully. So if I head back to the form now and try to resubmit it, you can see we immediately fail now. And if we look at the response, it's because we have invalid origin. And this is because by default, Better-Auth requires you to explicitly declare the origins that your requests are coming from for better security practices. So we can define our origin explicitly back in our Better-Auth module. In the instance configuration here, we set trusted origins, and this is where you would put the URL you have for your client-side app. So in my case, I'll add a new environment variable and call it UI URL. And in our case, we know this will be at localhost 3001. And now in the app module, we can read it from the config service. So let's inject the config service inside of our function here and make sure we also add config service. And now we can pull it off. So config service.getterThrow, we can use the UI URL here and have that as a trusted origin. Now make sure we also add the config module to our imports array. And now this should be working. So if we head back to resubmit it, we now get a different error here saying that email and password signup is not enabled. And that's because we have to explicitly opt into the authentication methods that we want in Better-Auth. To do this, we'll configure email and password and set enabled to true. So you could configure further settings here and enable other authentication solutions like social auth as well. So now finally, if we go back and resubmit, we can see we are now successfully logged in, and we can actually see our session component is rendering the current logged in user, which is awesome. We can see it also sent a request to the backend to get the current session. And you can see here in the cookies tab, we now have this Better-Auth.session token cookie set. And this is the secure JWT cookie that actually gets sent to our server to establish our authentication and make sure that our user is actually authenticated. So this cookie will get sent to the server with every request, and that's how we actually perform our authentication to the server. So now we're successfully logged in, and if we go ahead and sign out, we can see we no longer have the session established and we no longer have that cookie. So we can see if I now try signing back in, it works properly. And signing out actually calls the sign out endpoint, and we no longer have that cookie set. So one thing I want to show you is if after we sign in, we can actually see in the database, well, first we can check to see that my user is in here. So you can see the user was created as expected, which is great. But also if we look at the session table, we can now see we have a new session for the users that has been logged in. And so this ensures that the user is actually established a session, and we can actually set the expiration for the session here. And so this ensures that if we remove the session, the user will no longer be authenticated. And so this is great. We now have end-to-end authentication in our application thanks to Better-Auth. Now, one last thing I want to show you is how we can integrate NestJS middleware into this to prevent users from accessing pages without being authenticated. So let's go ahead and see how we can do this next. All right, so next up, let's go ahead and create a sample page in our application that we can actually navigate to and ensure that we protect with our Next.js middleware. So I'll go ahead and inside of our app directory, let's create a new page called dashboard. So since we're using the app router, we'll create this under dashboard folder and create a page.tsx, which we know will be rendered when we go to /dashboard. So we'll go ahead and export default function dashboard. And so in here, we'll just return a simple JSX expression. We'll wrap it inside of a div and we'll apply some basic styling. So I'll give this a container style, MX auto, some padding as well. And I'll have another div inside of here. So I'll give this max width 4XL and give it MX auto. And then finally, we'll have one more div where we'll set the class name to margin top 8, background white, give it a little padding and rounded as well as a bit of a shadow. And inside of this div, we're just going to have an H2 that says protected content because we're going to ensure that only signed in users can access this page. And so I'll apply some basic styling to this text as well. And now underneath the H2, we'll have a simple paragraph that says this is a protected dashboard page that only authenticated users can access. So this is a very common scenario inside of your application where you only want users that are logged in to access a given page. So if we go to /dashboard right now, of course, we'll be able to see this page because we don't have any authentication checks on our Next.js app. And so that's what we want to go ahead and now implement. Well, to do this in Next.js, we know we can create a simple middleware function that will ensure we actually execute it every time we request a new page in Next.js. So inside of the web root, make sure we create a middleware.ts file, and we'll export a sync function middleware that gets passed in the next request. This is of type next request from next server. And so the first thing I want to do is go ahead and determine what page we're actually on. So we'll extract the path name from request.nextURL. And so this is to check to see if we are on a protected route, because most of the time you only have certain routes that you want to protect. However, you could alter this if you wanted to protect all routes. In our case, we'll have a dedicated array where we check to see protected routes here. So we'll add /dashboard, for example. And then we'll check to see if protected routes.sum, and then check to see if the route inside a protected route, well, we can look at the path name that we extracted and see if it starts with and pass in the actual route that we're iterating over. And so that's going to check to see if we are on a protected page. Then we can go ahead and now check to see if we have that Better-Auth session cookie that we know only authenticated users will have. So we'll check to see the session cookie here is equal to request.cookies.get and look for the Better-Auth.session token, and that gets set only if we're logged in. And so now we can check to see if we don't have session cookie, then I want to go ahead and redirect the user. So we can use next response.redirect and pass in new URL. And in this case, I just want to go to the root of our application, which we know will render the login component. So this is exactly what we want. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and return next response.next, which will continue on and serve the page requested. Finally, we have to export const config where we want this middleware to actually run. So we pass in a matcher array. In our case, we want to execute this at /dashboard/:path*, so any subdirectories of our dashboard page. And so make sure we fix this typo here for middleware. And now if we try to go to /dashboard without actually being authenticated, you'll see we're immediately redirected back here to the sign-in component. However, if we do sign in and we have that cookie available, well, we can see we're rendering our session here. And now if we go to dashboard, we can see the protected content. So that's great. Now, the last thing I want to show you is a couple of useful helper functions inside of our Better-Auth NestJS Backend that can help you when writing your routes. So in order to show you this, I want to go back to our backend here, and in our users directory, in our users controller, recall we have this get session route. Now, of course, we know that Better-Auth has its own session API that it's using already to return the session. However, it's very common inside of our NestJS backend for other routes that we need to get access to the current logged in user. Well, Better-Auth makes it very easy to do this. You can simply use the @session decorator from NestJS Better-Auth, and this will return you the underlying session of the logged in user. So this will be of type user session. And now we actually have the logged in user available inside of our NestJS code, which is super useful because you often need to get access to that user information inside of the backend. So in this case, let's just return the session.user as an example, and we can test this API out. So I'll go back to our dashboard component here, and just for simplicity's sake, I'll just make this a use client, so a client component, and let's go ahead and write a quick function to actually call that API. So I'll write a use effect hook here that will run when our component mounts. So we'll have const fetch session, set it equal to an async function, and this will simply await a call to fetch, call /API users session to hit that endpoint. And of course, we know this is going to pass our secure JWT cookie so that we actually will be authenticated. And so we'll get access to the response here, and I'll call it const res. And then we'll go ahead and parse the response. So we'll call res.json. And then let's just simply log out the parsed response here so we can see that we're actually getting back that session object from the server and see that we actually get access to it. So we'll call fetch session here. Now if we go back to our terminal and look at our console logs, we can see we have this pending promise. So make sure we actually await the call to res.json. And now you can see we actually have a 404. And that's because if you recall, our Next.js UI is actually forwarding all requests at /API, and it's including the API to the endpoint. And so in our case, well, for our regular endpoints, we don't actually have this /API prefix. So you could actually add this prefix to the backend, or in our case, what we can actually do is simply update the next rewrite here and say only requests at API/auth should be rewritten to include API. And then we can actually include another rewrite here that checks to see other requests at /API. Well, we just won't include the API along to the server. And so now with this in place, if we refresh, you can see we are now forwarding the request along with no API, which our controller actually expects. And we have the session object here coming back from the server being logged out. We can see this in the dev tools here. We're calling that API user session, and we get back the response. So that's really useful to have. Another useful Better-Auth decorator that we have access to is allowing an endpoint to be public facing without authentication. So recall earlier we actually applied our auth guard to all endpoints, which means that all endpoints by default have authentication enabled. However, sometimes you have certain endpoints where you actually don't want authentication and you want to make them publicly available. So let's go ahead and create a new get endpoint here, and we'll just call this public as a test endpoint, and I'll call it get public, and we'll just return true. Now, of course, if we go to Postman and try executing this by going to /users/public and send a get request here, we of course know we're going to get a 401 unauthorized because we're not sending that session cookie. However, what we can do is utilize this @public decorator from Better-Auth, and that will tell Better-Auth to exclude this route from JWT authentication. And now we can see we can actually get a response back without any cookie. And so this is really useful if you have some public routes in your application. So I hope this lecture on Better-Auth was super helpful for you to see how easy it is to get up and running with authentication inside of your full stack web apps. It makes it super easy to set up authentication in a generic way. And thanks to this Better-Auth NestJS implementation, there's very little work we have to do to get it up and running and connected to our database. There's also a whole host of other options we can configure to further tune it in terms of our session and other authentication methods like social auth. So again, I'll leave the docs below if you want to dive a bit deeper. However, I really hope this lecture has been useful for you in terms of getting started with implementing Better-Auth in your application. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.